Hi, I'm reading my next chapter called Music. Benjamin still hadn't told anybody he wasn't Mark Miller. His grades had never been better. Mark Miller is a lot smarter than Benjamin Nushmut, he thought. When they chose up teams for kickball, he was always the first one picked. Mark Miller is a better kicker than Benjamin Nushmut, he realized. The girls in the class liked him too. Mark Miller is better looking than Benjamin Nushmut, he decided. But unfortunately, he knew he had to tell Mrs. Jules his real name. He sighed and slowly raised his hand. Mrs. Jules gave him a tambourine. He had been so busy thinking about his problem, he hadn't noticed that Mrs. Jules was passing out musical instruments. She had just asked, who would like the tambourine? So when he raised his hand, she gave it to him. Who would like the triangle? Asked Mrs. Jules. Joe raised his hand, and Mrs. Jules gave it to him. Why is it called a triangle? Asked Joe. I don't know, said Mrs. Jules. Maybe because it's shaped like a triangle, suggested John. No, that can't be it, said Mrs. Jules. Then the tambourine would have to be called a circle. Maybe it was invented by a person named Joe Triangle, said Randy. That's probably it, said Mrs. Jules. She held up the next instrument. It was the glockenspiel. Who would like the glockenspiel? She asked. Sherry raised her hand. Nobody asked why it was called a glockenspiel. It was obvious. Mrs. Jules gave the bells to Stephen. Why are they called bells? He asked. Nobody knew. Joy got the bongo drums. Todd got the bass drum. Jenny snared the snare drum, and Leslie got the kettle drum. When they banged on them, it hurt everybody else's eardrums. Mrs. Jules gave one cymbal to Calvin and the other cymbal to Bebby. DJ got the gong. The three Erics got kazoos. Mrs. Jules shouted, Uno, dos, tres, cuatro. The children all played their instruments. They shook, rattled, rocked, and rolled. Joy bonged her bongos, DJ gonged his gong, Sherry glockened her glockenspiel, Stephen jingled his bells, Calvin and Bebby slapped their cymbals together, and Joe's triangle went ting. But something didn't sound right. What's wrong, Mark? Mrs. Jules shouted over the music. Why aren't you playing the tambourine? My name's not Mark, said Benjamin. It's Benjamin Nushmut. I'm sorry for not telling you before. What? Asked Mrs. Jules. I can't hear you. My name isn't Mark, he said. It's Benjamin. Louder, said Mrs. Jules. So everyone played louder. Todd bashed his bass drum. Leslie cooked on her kettle drum. Calvin and Bebby crashed their cymbals together. And Joe's triangle went ting. My name is Benjamin, shouted Benjamin. Mrs. Jules put her hand to her ear. Louder, she said, so everyone played louder. DJ kabonged his gong, Joy changoed her bongos, Ball splacked his castanets, Jenny spaghettied her snare drum, Calvin and Bebby whammered their cymbals, and Joe's triangle went ting. My name's Benjamin Nushmut, hollered Benjamin Nushmut. Louder, yelled Mrs. Jules, so everyone played louder. The three Erics screamed into their kazoos. Calvin and Bebby ran to the opposite sides of the room with their cymbals and charged towards each other. Suddenly the door flew open, and a man entered. Benjamin had never seen him before. The whole class became quiet. It was Mr. Kidswater, the principal. Calvin and Bebby screeched to a halt just in time. Their cymbals were less than an inch apart. Is something the matter? Mr. Kidswater asked. Mrs. Jules? Several teachers have complained about your music, said Mr. Kidswater. Their students are having trouble hearing. I understand, said Mrs. Jules. Good, said Mr. Kidswater. He walked out of the room. Okay, you heard Mrs. Kidswater, said Mrs. Jules. We'll have to play louder so everyone can hear. Uno, dos, tres, cuatro. They shook, rattled, rocked, and rolled. Benjamin frampled his tambourine. Excellent, Mark, shouted Mrs. Jules. He smiled. He had never played so well before. Mark Miller is a better musician than Benjamin Nushmut, he thought. The end. And my next chapter is called Chapter 11, Kathy and DJ.